It was 05:17 local time in the North Atlantic, where the sea state remained calm and visibility was perfectly clear. On the massive flight deck of a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier, yellow shirts guided an FA-18 into its launch position. Deep below the deck, the nuclear reactor output held steady, while all radar scopes remained clean and free of targets. Suddenly, the silence of the morning was shattered as a sharp sonar transient spike appeared on the acoustic display screen. The sonar operator reported high-speed cavitation at bearing 087, with a voice that contained no hesitation or trace of emotion. Inside the Combat Information Center, tactical officers turned their heads toward the display to analyze the incoming mechanical noise patterns. The signature was definitely not biological or surface noise, appearing instead as a violent and sustained mechanical output from below. The sonar team confirmed additional transients and identified 3 separate screws moving at high speed toward the carrier's massive hull. A brief beat of silence passed before the warning of torpedoes in the water echoed through the ship's command centers. General quarters sounded instantly, causing the carrier's long passageways to flash with the urgent red glow of battle lantern. Watertight doors began sealing in their predetermined sequence as sailors moved through the ship at a very controlled, professional run. There was no frantic shouting because every crew member had drilled this exact scenario dozens of times during their training. Now that the threat was real, the tactical action officer stepped forward to evaluate the inbound tracks and the range. The estimated range was 9,000 yards, with the speed remaining high and the bearing holding steady on the tactical screens. On the ocean surface, the aircraft carrier maintained its course for 3 more seconds to ensure the most precise tracking. Then the order came to apply right full rudder and flank speed, pushing the Nimitz-class hull to its absolute limits. An aircraft carrier displaces over 100,000 tons of steel, meaning it does not pivot like a smaller and more agile destroyer. Every turn is a battle of physics and momentum, but even a slight heading change can disrupt a torpedo solution. The escorts reacted first, as 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers screening the carrier swung outward to meet the incoming underwater threat. Their powerful screws bit hard into the Atlantic waters, while their long-towed sonar arrays streamed far behind the ships. The tactical action officer called for a final classification as acoustic analysis software raced across the high-resolution command center screens. The acoustic signature was not American or Allied, matching known Russian torpedo profiles with a high degree of technical certainty. The wake-homing logic was likely engaged, which meant that the incoming weapons were not simply tracking acoustic noise. Time to impact was now under 3 minutes, creating immense pressure on the carrier's defensive systems and crew. On the carrier's massive stern, the first line of underwater defense deployed as the SLQ-25 Nixie decoys splashed. These decoys emit a much larger acoustic signature, which is designed to make the incoming torpedo choose wrong. Underwater, the geometry of the battle tightened as the torpedoes adjusted their tracks based on the loud decoys. One track shifted, suggesting a successful decoy acquisition, but the other 2 remained locked on the main hull. There was no deviation in the final track, which meant that at least one weapon had a clean solution. Inside the CIC, the commanding officer remained calm and ordered the team to maintain the formation's overall integrity. This launch did not come from a distance, but rather from inside the strike group's own defensive ring. A new contact appeared on sonar at bearing 091, submerged at a depth of 150 meters. There was a submarine, far too close for comfort, hiding within the very center of the defensive formation. Active sonar pulses from the nearest destroyer slammed into the water, returning sharp metallic echoes from the submarine's hull. The Russian acoustic profile was confirmed, and the implication was clear that this was a very deliberate act. From the forward escort, vertical launch hatches opened as the rocket-assisted torpedoes prepared for a very quick counter-launch. The rocket ignited and tore skyward before plunging into the sea near the submarine's last recorded sonar position. A dull underwater detonation rolled through the Atlantic like distant thunder, shaking the carrier from the pressure wave. The range to the incoming torpedoes was now 6,000 yards as the crew monitored the effectiveness of the decoys. One weapon veered off course, proving the Nixie system worked, but the remaining 2 continued their lethal advance. At 4,000 yards, the carrier continued its massive turn, with the hull leaning heavily into its own momentum. Every degree of the turn mattered, because the physics of the water would determine the final outcome of impact. On the flight deck, all aircraft were chained down while the crew waited in silence for the coming shock. Above the ocean surface, everything appeared calm. But below it, 3 weapons were racing toward the strike group's heart. The escorts tightened their arc as the submarine attempted to slip deeper into the cold Atlantic water column. Time was running out as the distance closed to under 2,000 yards, leaving the crew with several vital seconds. It was 5:20 local time, and the deep ocean was no longer quiet as the battle reached its terrifying peak. The sonar operator reported that the inbound torpedoes were now within a range of 5,000 yards from the carrier's hull. 2 of the tracks were holding steady, while the third weapon appeared to be oscillating between several different acoustic targets. On the bridge, the helmsman answered the command instantly by applying the full right rudder to the massive steel ship. The carrier's bow began its slow and massive swing toward the starboard side to avoid the incoming and lethal weapons. At flank speed, the hull of a Nimitz-class carrier can push past 30 knots through the cold and heavy waves. Every second was calculated against the remaining distance to ensure that the ship moved out of the torpedo's direct path. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer recommended an evasive pattern Delta to confuse the incoming enemy seekers. The deployment of acoustic decoys continued from the stern to provide a much louder and more attractive target far underwater. Additional countermeasures streamed into the Atlantic, vibrating with engineered noise that was designed to overpower the torpedo's active seeker head. Underwater, the first inbound weapon began to hesitate, and its track shifted 10 degrees away from the main carrier hull. The torpedo was biting on the decoy, but the second track showed no deviation from its original center mass solution. This weapon was likely operating in active mode, which meant it could reacquire the carrier even after a near miss. The third track was lost momentarily, but the tactical officers knew that being lost did not mean the threat was gone. The nearest Arleigh Burke-class destroyer drove straight toward the threat axis to place itself between the carrier and torpedo vectors. This was a deliberate move dictated by screening doctrine to protect the most valuable asset in the entire strike group. The destroyer crew deployed their own countermeasure rockets to create a wall of sound and confusion for the incoming weapons. A compact anti-torpedo interceptor launched from the deck to meet the threat before it reached its deadly lethal detonation range. Back in the CIC, the range calls became much tighter as the weapons closed the distance to 3,500 yards away. The submarine contact remained active at bearing 091, while increasing its depth to over 200 meters below the surface. The Russian boat was trying to slip beneath the thermal layer to mask its own signature and avoid detection efforts. However, the boat fired from inside the protective geometry, which left no clean exit from the strike group's powerful sensors. The commander approved a second rocket-assisted torpedo launch to ensure the submarine could not escape the strike group. Another vertical launch hatch snapped open, and the motor flare was bright even in the early morning light. Seconds later, the weapon plunged into the ocean, while homing on the submarine's last known and recorded acoustic trace. Below the surface, shockwaves rippled outward as the first torpedo detonated harmlessly against the massive acoustic decoys. A low underwater thud registered across the sonar displays, confirming that one weapon had been successfully defeated. However, Track 2 was now at 2,000 yards, and this was considered the most dangerous threat to the hull. Damage control lockers were already manned on the carrier, with fire teams standing by with their breathing apparatus ready. Flooding control kits were staged along the most vulnerable compartments, because no one wanted to wait for an impact. The escort's anti-torpedo round entered the water at high speed to begin its very short and violent intercept mission. The carrier continued its massive turn while its screws churned hard to complicate the torpedo's predictive tracking logic. Track 3 was reacquired with a shifted bearing, indicating that it was likely trying to reacquire the main hull. This meant at least 2 threats remained viable, as the range closed down to only 1,000 yards away. Inside the Combat Information Center, the voices stayed level as the order was given to brace for imminent shock. The interceptor closed the distance first, and a violent detonation flashed across the sonar displays with white noise. The massive display bloomed with interference, which briefly obscured the confirmation of the intercept on the second track. Seconds stretched into an eternity as the crew waited to see if the lethal weapon was still moving forward. Track 2 was finally confirmed as no longer tracking inbound, which meant the threat had been successfully neutralized. A single exhale moved through the compartment, but the crew knew Track 3 was still closing at 800 yards. The final torpedo was now within lethal proximity, where even a near miss could rupture the heavy steel plates. The carrier leaned even deeper into its evasive turn, while deploying additional countermeasures to protect the propulsion shafts. Another decoy splashed into the Atlantic to emit a much stronger acoustic signature than the carrier's own massive hull. Underwater, the torpedo began to show oscillation, which proved it was confused and torn between several different targets. The anti-torpedo system aboard the second escort activated, and a new interceptor was sent diving into the water. At a range of 300 yards, a violent underwater explosion detonated just short of the carrier's massive steel hull. The massive shockwave hit like a heavy hammer, rattling the electronic consoles and vibrating every single deck plating. The carrier shuddered violently from the impact, but held its steady course as no immediate flooding alarms were heard. Sonar confirmed that Track 3 was officially terminated, meaning all 3 incoming torpedoes had been successfully defeated. The Russian boat attempted a saturation strike from inside the defensive perimeter, but failed to breach the carrier's hull. Now it was 5:22 local time, and the mission changed in a single word: from survival to absolute control. The commanding officer shifted the strike group to prosecution, meaning the hunt for the submarine was about to begin. On the flight deck, the first MH-60R Seahawk helicopter was already spinning up its powerful and loud rotors. The crew chief gave a final signal as the rotors bit aggressively into the cold and biting Atlantic wind. This was not a routine patrol launch, but a hunter launch designed to find and destroy the underwater threat. Seahawk 1 was airborne quickly, banking toward the destroyer screen while carrying a very deadly payload of lightweight torpedoes. Beneath its fuselage hung a collection of advanced sonar buoys and Mark 54 torpedoes, built specifically for this underwater war. Below the surface, the submarine dove deeper to a depth of 350 meters while rapidly altering its southern course. It was trying to break contact by using the chaos of the previous detonations and decoy noise as cover. The escorts tightened their geometry as 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers formed a narrowing and disciplined arc. Their towed arrays were stretched wide to regain contact with the enemy boat through active sonar pulses. The ocean answered with metallic echoes, because the submarine could not outrun the simple physics of modern detection. Seahawk 1 deployed pattern alpha from 200 feet above the Atlantic, dropping cylindrical sonobuoys into the water. Each buoy splashed and activated immediately to begin transmitting vital acoustic data back to the strike group. Within seconds, a grid of sensors formed around the last known position of the retreating Russian boat. The helicopter crew confirmed contact at a depth of 380 meters, while the submarine slowed its speed. This slowing could mean the submarine was preparing to fight back, or that it had sustained serious damage. The tactical officer recommended weapon release, and the request was approved by the commander of the strike group. The Seahawk banked slightly to release a Mark 54 torpedo, which entered the water with a very controlled splash. The torpedo entered the search pattern by using passive sensors first, before switching to its powerful active sonar mode. Inside the carrier's combat information center, every single movement of the weapon was tracked on the glowing tactical screens. The submarine reacted instantly by increasing its speed and deploying several acoustic decoys to distract the incoming lethal threat. Bubble clouds and noise generators bloomed below the surface to create false signatures designed to seduce the tracking torpedo. The Mark 54 torpedo adjusted its course and continued tracking the main hull despite the defensive efforts of the submarine. Suddenly, a violent underwater detonation occurred, causing the sonar display to spike with a flash of intense white noise. This was not a confirmed kill yet, but the submarine was slowing rapidly as its depth began to fluctuate. The Russian captain was clearly fighting for control of his vessel, while the strike group continued its relentless pursuit. Seahawk 2 was now airborne and extending the acoustic net by dropping more sonobuoys into the dark Atlantic waters. The grid tightened around the enemy boat as the helicopter crew confirmed the submarine was moving at 5 knots. 5 knots is not a sufficient escape speed when facing the advanced technology of a modern carrier strike group. Authorization for a second weapon was granted, and another Mark 54 torpedo was dropped from the hovering Seahawk helicopter. The torpedo dived into the depths and quickly locked onto the mechanical signature of the struggling Russian attack submarine. The submarine attempted a desperate hard turn while diving to a depth of 400 meters in the cold ocean. The Atlantic in this specific region is not infinitely deep, meaning there was no abyss for the boat to vanish. The second weapon tracked steady and true as the seconds stretched out for the crew watching the sonar displays. A second detonation followed, which was much louder and closer to the target than the previous underwater explosion had been. Sonar operators confirmed the sounds of structural breakup, including metallic tearing and the rapid release of compressed internal air. Fragmenting debris signatures began to rise through the water column, along with the first visible traces of heavy fuel oil. Silence eventually followed the destruction, as the sonar screens showed no active propulsion or coherent contact in the area. The Russian submarine was no longer fighting or maneuvering, marking the end of the violent engagement beneath the waves. The carrier held its steady course while the helicopters continued to orbit overhead to verify the entire debris field. 3 torpedoes were fired at the ship, but the platform that launched them was now silent and broken forever. It was 6:05 local time, and the Atlantic Ocean looked completely unchanged, with its low swells and clean horizon. There was no smoke or fire to be seen, but inside the strike group, every detail had shifted forever. The order to secure from general quarters moved through the passageways as the modified anti-submarine posture was formally maintained. Watertight doors reopened in sequence, and the red battle lighting faded back to the standard white illumination of the ship. Every sailor returned to their station with a more deliberate sense of purpose after facing a very real underwater threat. 3 torpedoes had been fired at the United States aircraft carrier, but not a single one had struck the hull. Inside the Combat Information Center, the sonar tapes were already being archived to preserve the full and detailed acoustic record. Every transient and cavitation spike would be studied frame by frame to understand the enemy's propulsion noise and guidance logic. Survival was only half the mission, while gaining a complete understanding of the engagement was the other vital half today. On the flight deck, operations resumed in controlled phases as an FA-18 taxied forward toward the steam-powered catapult system. Within minutes, the Combat Air Patrol was airborne again, because maintaining a strong defensive posture always matters in modern warfare. Engineering teams completed their structural surveys and reported that the hull stress remained within the acceptable and safe design tolerances. The shock waves from the underwater detonations were significant, but the carrier was built for the harsh reality of war. Layered steel and compartmentalized design ensured that the massive ship remained fully operational and ready for any further combat actions. At 6:18 local time, the Boeing P-8 Poseidon completed its final surveillance sweep over the expanding oil and debris field. No secondary contacts were detected, and the Arleigh Burke destroyers returned to their standard screening formation around the primary vessel. Modern naval warfare operates within a margin of minutes, where there are no warning shots or long speeches given before. The response was a perfect combination of geometry, speed, and discipline that protected the heart of the entire strike group. Somewhere beneath the surface, twisted steel now rests in the cold water, while the carrier sails on its original course. This lesson proves that inside a U.S. carrier strike group, there is no single point of failure for an enemy. As the morning sun climbs higher, the Atlantic reflects calm light across the gray decks and the silent radar arrays. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into naval tactics, so please like the video and subscribe to Navy Show.